Welcome to the Sleepy Christian, where we rest in the Word and reflect on the mysteries of God's eternal love. Tonight, we're going to take a peaceful journey into one of the most powerful moments in all of history, the very instant Jesus rose from the grave. But instead of just looking at what happened on earth, we're going to close our eyes, breathe slowly, and imagine what was happening in heaven at that very same moment. Was there silence? Was there a song? What did the angels see? What did the Father feel? As we begin, let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Whether you're in a quiet town or a bustling city, you're part of this gentle family of faith. Now let us begin. Before the stone rolled away, before the women arrived at the tomb, before even the first ray of sunlight kissed the earth that morning, heaven held its breath. There was a silence unlike any silence that had ever existed before. A holy stillness, not the emptiness of absence, but the fullness of anticipation. The angels, whose voices had once shouted at creation, now stood motionless, silent, reverent, watching. All of heaven, the hosts, the elders, the cherubim, and the seraphim, those who had worshipped before the throne since time began, they had paused, not out of fear, not out of confusion, but out of deep, eternal reverence. Something sacred was unfolding, and even they could not yet fathom the depth of it. The throne room of heaven, radiant and eternal, glowed gently. There was no chaos here, no panic, only an unspeakable stillness, the kind of stillness a mother feels before she hears her child cry for the first time, the kind of stillness that trembles with the power of what's about to come. The Father sat upon his throne, and in his heart burned something no angel had ever seen, a love so fierce, so personal, so perfectly just, and yet so full of mercy that the very fabric of eternity seemed to shiver in its presence. All of time had pointed to this moment. The weight of every prophecy, every covenant, every whispered prayer of every heart that had ever longed for redemption was now pressing into this single point in history. In a borrowed tomb on a small piece of land in the corner of the Roman Empire, the body of Jesus Christ lay wrapped in burial cloth. But heaven wasn't looking at Rome. Heaven wasn't looking at the guards. Heaven wasn't focused on the stone. Heaven's eyes were fixed on him. Not the suffering Son, but the soon-to-be risen one. Creation itself seemed to echo heaven's hush. The trees were still, the wind barely stirred. Even the birds seemed to pause their songs, as if nature instinctively knew that something sacred, something utterly unrepeatable, was about to happen. The angels closest to the throne looked to the Father. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They could feel it in their being. Something glorious was about to awaken. This wasn't just a man returning to life. This was life itself rising. This wasn't just about a body breathing again. This was about sin being broken. This was about death being defeated. This was about love, proving that it would go farther than pain, deeper than the grave, and higher than the heavens. The moment was near. And so, heaven did what it had never done before. It waited, it paused, it held its breath. For in the stillness of that early morning, something was stirring beneath the earth, and the echo of it would reach the stars. And then, without trumpet or alarm, without thunder or flame, the first light of glory appeared. Not the light of the sun, though dawn had begun to creep silently over the hills of Judea, but a different light. A light not born of stars or fire or anything of this world. It came not from above, but from within. A light older than the galaxies, purer than crystal, and more powerful than any force known to man. It radiated softly at first, like the glow of an ember beneath ashes, but this ember was alive, and it was awakening. Inside the stillness of the tomb, where darkness had held dominion for 3 long days, the very air began to change. The atoms stirred. The silence trembled. There was no explosion, no blinding flash, only a sacred brilliance beginning to rise from within the body of Jesus. His chest, still and breathless moments ago, now began to lift, And as his lungs filled with breath again, it was not with ordinary air, but with the breath of eternal life. Not borrowed, not given, not restored, but fully, powerfully his. The breath that had spoken the universe into being had returned to him. And with it, light flowed. It shone through the burial cloth, through the cracks in the tomb's walls, through the layers of stone and dust. It was not limited by space or matter. It was resurrection light, and it had no enemy strong enough to stop it. In heaven, the moment did not go unnoticed. The angels felt it first, a tremble in the foundation of time, a pulse that echoed across the eternal expanse. Not a sound, not a shout, but a presence. The presence. The light they had worshipped for eternity, now moving once more on the earth. The Father did not rise. He did not need to. His will had been spoken long before, and now it was being fulfilled. His eyes, infinite in their depth, watched with a love so vast, so uncontainable, that if even a sliver of it touched the earth fully, the mountains would melt and the seas would roar. The veil that had been torn in the temple days earlier was only the beginning. Now the veil between death and life itself was being shredded by the glory of the risen Son. As Jesus opened his eyes, all of heaven exhaled, not in relief, but in worship. Because this wasn't a return to life the way Lazarus had known. This was not resurrection into the same fragile flesh, doomed to die again. No, this was transformation, glorification. The eternal Son of God, having descended into death, now returning with keys in his hand and victory in his veins. That first light. It wasn't just something to see, it was something that changed the universe. Demons fled from it, death recoiled from it. Time itself seemed to pause in awe. In the spiritual realm, the light was a signal, a banner, a declaration written not with ink but with radiant power. He is risen, not just alive, not just restored, exalted. In the distance, the earth began to rumble, quietly at first, like the stretching of something ancient. The stone that sealed the tomb began to shift, not because men pushed it, but because heaven's will moved it. The seal of Rome could not withstand the purpose of God. Gravity bowed, matter yielded, and outside the tomb, the morning sun finally crested the horizon, just as the true light of the world stood up inside the darkness and walked forward. But even that sunrise, brilliant and warm and golden, was pale in comparison to what had just occurred within those stone walls. Because for the first time in all of history, a human body had passed through death and come out the other side glorified, never to die again. The angels stood again, not in silence, but in reverence. They had seen stars born, oceans formed, and kingdoms rise and fall, but they had never seen this. The Son of God, shining with the light of heaven and the strength of perfect love, had risen, and with him a new dawn had begun. Not just for that morning or for that land, but for all of creation, forever. There are moments in heaven when the angels do not sing, not because they are sad, not because they are confused, but because something so sacred is unfolding that words and music would only diminish its glory. And so they stand in silent awe, their wings still, their eyes wide with holy wonder, their entire beings drawn into worship so deep it goes beyond sound. This was one of those moments. The resurrection of Jesus wasn't just an event on earth, it was a celestial revelation, a moment that pulled back the curtain of eternity and allowed heaven's hosts to witness the deepest mystery of God's plan. That love would win, that death would lose, and that the light of the world had chosen to walk through the darkness and return victorious. And when the angels saw it, they were not loud. They were humbled. Imagine tens of thousands, millions upon millions of angels, creatures of fire and light, who had seen the birth of galaxies and the fall of Satan, now standing still as if the entire kingdom of heaven was holding its breath in reverse. Not in anticipation this time, but in reverent, wordless worship. There is a kind of praise that doesn't need volume, a kind that flows like a quiet river, steady and powerful. And in that moment, that's what heaven became, a sea of light, silently flowing toward the throne in awe of what had just been accomplished. For they saw him. They saw Jesus, not beaten and bloodied as he had been on the cross, but radiant. His wounds remained, not as scars of defeat, but as badges of eternal triumph. The Lamb who had been slain was now the Lion who had conquered, and his glory was not violent or boastful, it was humble, gentle, yet absolutely unshakable. The angels who had once ministered to him in the wilderness, who had hovered near Gethsemane, longing to intervene, now gazed upon him as he stepped into resurrection life. They did not cry out because they were stunned by the depth of his love. How could he, who never sinned, walk so willingly into death for creatures made of dust? How could the Eternal One allow himself to be mocked, spat on, crushed, and still rise not with vengeance but with mercy? It silenced them, for they were witnessing something they had never known personally: grace. Grace was not for them. When their kind had fallen, there was no cross offered, no redemption path opened. And yet, for humanity, for these small, frail, wandering children of earth, God had sent his Son. And not just to teach, not just to heal, but to suffer, to die, and then to rise. The angels watched as the spiritual realms shook and settled. Demonic forces had already begun to scatter, their grip on the world now broken by a single act of perfect obedience. The chains they had forged for centuries were now melting in the presence of the risen Christ. The angels said nothing, but they knew. They knew that this was the moment all of history bent toward. The moment when God's justice and mercy kissed. The moment when the curse was reversed. The moment when the gates of heaven would one day swing open wide enough for sinners, for prodigals, for the poor and broken and lost to walk in, covered by the blood of the one who rose. Even the highest-ranking angels, those who had guarded Eden, who had led armies, who had stood beside the throne for eons, bowed, not out of duty, but out of love. Because even though they didn't fully understand how such love could exist, they knew they were in its presence. And so they stood, not with harps, not with shouting, but in perfect silence, a stillness so deep it vibrated with glory. Heaven had seen many wonders before, but nothing like this. There are moments when two worlds, heaven and earth, draw so close that the boundary between them seems to dissolve, not in chaos, not in noise, but in quiet glory. That morning, as Jesus stepped out of the tomb, the invisible veil that had long separated the seen from the unseen began to shimmer with divine energy. The wall between heaven and earth did not collapse. It opened. Something deep within creation responded. It was not loud, it was not visible to human eyes, but the spiritual realm was alive with movement. The veil between the natural and the eternal, once so thick that mankind could only glimpse beyond it through dreams, prophecies, or moments of prayer, was now thinning, almost translucent. Every resurrection breath Jesus took sent waves through both realms. His every step outside the tomb left footprints not only in dust, but in eternity. On earth, the guards were struck down like dead men, not by force, but by the sheer weight of glory they were never meant to behold. Their bodies froze, their minds blank, their spirits overwhelmed by something far beyond Roman discipline or fear. They had witnessed the unseeable, heaven touching earth. But what exactly was happening in that moment that human eyes could not see? It was as if the whole fabric of existence was realigning. The laws of nature, once so predictable, now bowed to the one who authored them. Gravity held no claim, matter obeyed him, time bent around him, and in the unseen realm, the very air vibrated with truth. Death had been defeated not by force, but by love. In heaven, the awareness spread like light spilling across a mountaintop, not through words, but through understanding. The cherubim who had guarded Eden's entrance with flaming swords now lowered their gaze in reverence. The seraphim, who cried, "Holy, holy, holy," since before time began, now found a new depth of holiness to behold. And for a moment, just a moment. Those on earth who had eyes to see could feel it too. The women approaching the tomb felt it. Before they even saw the stone rolled away, there was a shift in the air, something that spoke not to their ears, but to their souls. Mary Magdalene felt her heart tremble, not from fear, but from the unknowable pull of something sacred drawing near. The earth was still, yet alive with promise. The disciples, scattered and hiding, didn't know it yet, but in their spirits, a trembling had begun. A warmth not of this world, a memory stirring, hope, like a distant echo returning to hearts that had given up. The veil was growing thin. When Jesus rose, he didn't simply come back from the dead. He stepped through a cosmic doorway, from time into eternity, from brokenness into glory. And because of that, the whole relationship between heaven and earth was forever changed. Never again would God be unreachable. Never again would humanity walk the world without a path home. Because in that instant, Jesus had become the bridge, the living way, the true vine reaching up from the soil of earth to the throne of God and stretching his arms wide so that anyone, anywhere, could come close. The veil in the temple had already torn from top to bottom, yes, but this veil, the one in the human heart, the one between the realms, was also tearing, gently, beautifully, not to expose or frighten, but to invite. God was not just high and holy anymore, he was now near, close enough to touch, and through the risen Christ, the world would never be the same. Heaven wasn't distant anymore. It was leaning in, looking into the eyes of those who still wept, reaching into the hearts of those still bound by fear, whispering to the lonely, "You are not forgotten, he is alive, and so are you." It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. Because once the veil begins to thin, even the smallest whisper from heaven becomes louder than thunder. And the echo of that morning still travels across time, calling each soul to awaken, to draw near, and to see what the world cannot yet see, that the risen Christ has made heaven closer than ever before. In the heart of heaven, the Father watched, not with anxiety, not with surprise, but with a love so deep, so fierce, so ancient and unshakable that the entire universe was held together by it. A love that had waited since before time began for this very moment, the moment when his Son would rise. No eye could fully comprehend what burned within the Father's gaze that morning. It was not the distant look of a king watching history unfold. It was the look of a father who had sent his beloved into the darkest valley, knowing full well the pain, the betrayal, the agony that awaited him, and who now beheld his return. There is no earthly comparison for what the Father felt. When we speak of God smiling, we imagine something gentle, kind. But this was the smile of eternal triumph, the radiant expression of a father whose heart had held back the floodwaters of grief for 3 days, and who now released joy too vast for any realm to contain. He had watched his Son descend into death, not as a victim, but as a redeemer. He had seen him take on the sins of the world, carry every lie, every shame, every regret, and bury them in the grave. And now, he saw him step out, not broken, not bruised, but glorified, shining with a light that had never been dimmed, only hidden for a time. The Father's smile was not one of surprise. It was the smile of fulfillment. This was the plan. This had always been the plan. Before the stars were lit, before the oceans formed, before Adam drew breath, there had been a conversation. A covenant not written on stone or scrolls, but spoken heart to heart between the Father and the Son. A vow whispered in the sacred stillness of eternity. I will go, I will redeem them. And the Father had said, "You are my beloved Son. In you I am well pleased." That same voice, the one that spoke from the clouds at the Jordan, that echoed on the Mount of Transfiguration, now whispered across eternity, not for men to hear, but for angels, for creation, for the whole of heaven to feel. This is my Son, risen, triumphant, victorious, and still my beloved. It was not pride in the way humans understand pride. The Father's smile was not because of success or accomplishment. It was love, pure and blazing, love that had never faltered even as the nails were driven in, even as the sky turned black, even as the tomb was sealed. A love that never doubted, never wavered, because it was part of him. When Jesus opened his eyes in the tomb, he wasn't returning from a place unknown to the Father. The Spirit had been with him. The love of the Father had surrounded him. And yet, this moment, his rising, marked a new chapter in the divine story. The chapter where redemption became not just a promise, but a reality. And so the Father smiled, not because he had forgotten the suffering, but because the suffering had been worth it. Because now, the children who had been lost could be found. The ones who had wandered could be welcomed home. The ones covered in shame could be clothed in righteousness. All because his Son had said yes. Yes to the manger. Yes to the wilderness. Yes to the crowds and the cross. Yes to the tomb. Yes to resurrection. The Father smiled, and as he did, the light of heaven shifted, not brighter, but warmer, as if all of creation could sense that the most precious part of God's heart had returned, not because he was ever gone, but because his mission had been completed. And the beauty of it was this: the Father's smile was not only for the Son, it was also for us. For now, when he looks upon those who are in Christ, those who have placed their trust in the risen one, he sees not our failures, not our past, but his Son. His smile now stretches across the veil to every broken heart, every doubting soul, every weary wanderer. Because in his Son, he sees hope for us all. The Father watched the stone roll away. He watched the light spill out. He watched his Son step into the morning of a new creation. And he smiled, not just for what had happened, but for what had now become possible. That every child once lost in darkness might now walk in the light. That every story once marred by sin might now be rewritten by grace. That heaven and earth, once separated by death, might now be united in life eternal. And in that smile, there was peace. In that smile, there was rest. In that smile, the whole of heaven found its joy. Because the Father saw his Son, alive, glorified, home. In the quiet corners of heaven, where time is not measured by clocks, but by the unfolding of God's will, there exists a great scroll, not made of paper or parchment, not stored on shelves or sealed in boxes. This scroll is living, woven into the very essence of eternity. It is the record of all things, beginnings and endings, seeds planted and storms endured, promises spoken and promises kept, and written into its pages is the story of redemption. From the moment the first breath of man was drawn in Eden, from the very first heartbeat of humanity, this scroll began to unfurl, slowly, purposefully. Every prophecy, every covenant, every cry of the prophets was etched onto it, not as isolated events, but as a single, unbreakable narrative. And now, in that sacred morning when Jesus rose from the grave, the scroll reached a point it had long anticipated. It did not unroll quickly. It did not flutter like pages in the wind. It unfolded with weight, with purpose, with the gravity of millennia held in tension. What was written next had been written long before, but now it was being fulfilled. Every angel watched. This was not a scroll of fate, but of faithfulness. It was the story of God keeping his word. There, written in radiant script, invisible to human eyes, were the promises spoken through Abraham, that through his seed, all nations would be blessed. There were the laments of David, singing of a suffering servant. There were the words of Isaiah, "He was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities." And now, just beside those sorrowful lines, something new had appeared. He is risen. It was not ink that wrote it, but light, a holy flame that did not consume but illuminated. The letters danced, not in a spectacle, but in sacred reverence, declaring that the turning point of all history had arrived. The Redeemer had completed his mission. The Lamb had become the Lion. The slain had become the Sovereign. And the scroll continued to unfold. Now the names of those who would be saved, one by one, written not as numbers but as beloved souls, began to appear in the margins. Not just kings or prophets, but fishermen and widows, prisoners and children, outcasts and wanderers. Their names shimmered like stars across the vast tapestry of eternity. For the resurrection was not just an end, it was a beginning. A new chapter had been opened. The scroll that once wept now sang. The sorrow that had soaked its earlier pages was now transformed into a joy so powerful, so complete, that even heaven itself seemed to breathe it in. In the unseen realm, this scroll was more than a record. It was a living testament. It was the beating heart of God's great story, pulsing with grace. And at its center stood Christ. Not as a figure of the past, but as the eternal Word, the one in whom all the pages made sense. The angels, who had long wondered how it would all unfold, now saw it with clarity. They had sung at his birth. They had strengthened him in the wilderness. They had waited outside the sealed tomb, guarding a silence they didn't fully understand. But now, as the scroll unfurled before them, they understood. This was the moment all time had longed for. Every line pointed to it. Every mystery led to him. The scroll did not end there. No, it kept going. Because from that moment on, every act of faith, every whisper of repentance, every heart that turned toward the risen Christ would become part of the story. The scroll is still unfolding. It unfolds each time someone says yes to grace. Each time a soul once chained in guilt finds freedom. Each time a tear is wiped away in the name of the one who conquered death. Each time someone loves when it would have been easier to hate. Each time light breaks through the shadows because Jesus lives. In heaven, the scroll is not read aloud like a book. It is witnessed. It is lived. It is sung in silence and felt in worship. For it is not only about what God has done, it is about who he is, faithful, forever, and full of mercy. And there, written in fire and love, is the truth that defines the universe. The tomb is empty, the sun is risen, the story is alive. The gates of heaven had never been closed to the Son. They had watched him leave once before, when he stepped down into the world, clothed not in radiance, but in vulnerability. When he laid aside his heavenly glory to become an infant in a manger. When he walked among men with dust on his feet and the weight of the world already resting on his shoulders. Heaven had watched that departure with a reverent, aching stillness. Not because he was diminished, he never ceased to be divine, but because the King of Glory had chosen to hide his majesty beneath human flesh. But now, everything was different. This time, he was not returning humbled. He was not returning wounded. He was not returning alone. He was coming as the risen King, and all of heaven knew it. The moment Jesus stepped out of the tomb, heaven began preparing for his welcome, not because he needed it, not because he required honor, but because every soul in the kingdom, every angel who had ever beheld the face of the Father, longed to pour out worship that had waited since before the foundations of the world. It was not a celebration of noise. It was a welcome of reverence, of understanding, of awe. This was not simply the return of the Son. This was the coronation of the conqueror. The scars on his hands and feet were not signs of defeat. They were royal emblems, marks of victory, proof that he had passed through the valley of death, wrestled with sin, and emerged triumphant, not just for himself, but for the entire human race. And so heaven prepared. The gates, eternal, towering, and made not of gold, but of light and purity, began to open, not quickly, not with haste, but with solemn majesty, as though all of creation itself was parting to let him through. The angels gathered, not as a chaotic crowd, but in perfect order, each one drawn to their place, as if by the very rhythm of heaven's heartbeat. Archangels, whose names are known only to God, stood at attention. Hosts beyond number filled the expanse with stillness, their wings poised in anticipation. And then, he came. Not in robes woven by human hands, not in a chariot, or with earthly splendor, but clothed in glory, a radiance that did not shine on him, but from him. His eyes held eternity. His presence carried the scent of victory, of suffering turned to triumph, of death undone. Heaven's breath caught again, but this time not in suspense. It was adoration, complete, total, unrestrained. And the cry that rose was not a shout of command. It was not even words at first. It was worship itself, vibrating through the halls of eternity like a river bursting through a dam. Pure, perfect, unstoppable praise. He is worthy. Those three words echoed, not because they were repeated, but because they were true. So true that they echoed through every corner of heaven without needing to be spoken again. He is worthy. Worthy not only because he is the Son, worthy not only because he is divine, but worthy because he chose the cross, because he chose to suffer, because he bore the weight of sins he never committed and paid a price we could never afford. And now, he returned not as the Lamb who had been slain, but as the King of Kings. The heavenly elders, those who had laid their crowns before the throne for countless ages, now rose again and fell to their knees once more. Not out of tradition, not out of ritual, but because they were undone. He had done it. He had really done it. He had gone where no one else could go and come back with victory in his very breath. And as he entered the heavenly courts, there was no need for a herald. No one needed to announce him. His presence announced itself. Time itself seemed to bend in worship. The throne, eternal and unshaken, stood ready. And as the Son ascended, not only did he sit again at the right hand of the Father, but something profound happened, something that changed all of creation forever. He sat down not only as the Son of God, but as the Son of Man. A human body now sat upon the throne of heaven, glorified, yes, eternal, yes, divine, yes, but still human. The veil between heaven and earth had not only been torn, it had been bridged forever. And the welcome Jesus received was not just celebration, it was recognition. The heavens recognized him as their rightful king. The angels recognized him as their champion. The Father recognized him as the fulfillment of his will, and the universe itself recognized him as the center around which everything turns. The celebration did not end in song, it became song, and every note, every breath, every shimmer of light in heaven whispered the same truth over and over again in waves that will never cease. The King has returned, and he has won. Long before the women arrived at the tomb, long before the stone was seen rolled away, long before the news of the resurrection reached the ears of trembling disciples, the Spirit of God was already moving, not with force, not with flashes of thunder or bolts of lightning, but with a quiet, sacred power, a whisper that danced between heaven and earth, touching places no hand could reach, a whisper that didn't need to be heard by ears to be understood by souls. It was the whisper of resurrection, the whisper of life, the whisper of a promise kept. While the physical body of Jesus lay in the tomb, the Spirit had not been absent. The Spirit had never been absent. The Spirit had descended with him into the depths, into the silence, into the broken heart of the world. And now, as he rose, the Spirit moved like wind through dry bones, beginning a chain reaction that would echo across the ages. This whisper went first to the deepest places. It moved through the spiritual realm, unsettling ancient strongholds, the chains of guilt that had clung to generations, shaken loose, the walls of shame that had trapped human hearts for centuries, beginning to crack. No one saw it, no one heard it, but something shifted. The whisper traveled next into the earth itself. The soil that once drank Abel's blood now felt the blood of Christ reversing the curse. Every grain of dust, every blade of grass, every drop of dew began to remember its original design, to live under the light of the Creator's face, no longer groaning under the weight of decay. And then gently, the whisper moved through the hearts of people. Not everyone could feel it, not yet, but some could. Some woke that morning with a strange sense of peace they couldn't explain. Some who had been haunted by regret felt a flicker of hope they didn't expect. Some who had cried themselves to sleep the night before now found their tears suddenly still. It wasn't loud, it wasn't even clear, but it was real. Because the Spirit does not shout. The Spirit hovers. He broods over emptiness like he did in Genesis. He breathes into what is dead. He waits with divine patience for hearts to respond. And on that resurrection morning, the Spirit of God began to stir the souls of men and women in ways no theology could yet explain. He moved through closed doors where frightened disciples hid, planting seeds of courage. He moved through temples where scrolls lay open but lifeless, awakening the scriptures with new fire. He moved through the streets of Jerusalem, among the blind and the broken, whispering, "Something has changed. You are not alone. He lives." And with each whisper, hearts began to shift. With each breath, the world began to wake up. This is how God works, not always in earthquakes, not always in fire, but in the still, small voice that finds you when you are too tired to reach for Him. That meets you not in triumph, but in your shadows. That sings to you even when you've forgotten the sound of joy. The Spirit of God, the very breath of the Father, began to flow like a river through time, through history, through sorrow, not demanding attention, but offering healing, not overpowering, but inviting, not controlling, but freeing. And every heart that would ever feel the pull of God's love, even centuries later, was touched in some mysterious way by that whisper on resurrection morning. It was not just the beginning of the church, and it was not just the launch of a mission. It was the awakening of the human soul. The Spirit whispered not only that Jesus had risen, but that everything was different now. Death was no longer the final word. Sin no longer held absolute power. The wall between God and humanity no longer stood. From that morning forward, the Spirit would move freely, not limited to prophets or kings, not reserved for temples or priests, but poured out on sons and daughters, on young and old, on every heart willing to receive. And He still whispers today. He whispers to the weary, "Come to me." He whispers to the lost, "You are not forgotten." He whispers to the ashamed, "There is grace." He whispers to the doubting, "Touch my wounds and believe." What began in the tomb was not just a moment, it was a movement. And the Spirit, ever gentle, ever patient, continues to stir the world awake, one heart at a time. There are some victories that are quiet, some triumphs that unfold not with fanfare, but with a hush so profound it silences even the busiest corners of the universe. And then there are moments so radiant, so utterly drenched in glory, that even the stillness cannot contain them. This was one of those moments. The celebration had begun, not with drums or shouting, but with something far deeper. The very atmosphere of heaven began to rejoice. It was not a celebration like the world knows. It was not about confetti or noise or spectacle. It was a celebration of truth realized, of promises fulfilled, of love proven stronger than death. And it began with light, not sunlight, not fire, but the light of eternal joy, of a kingdom now made fully alive in the presence of the risen King. The angels did not wait for a command. They didn't need one. The very core of their being responded naturally, irresistibly to what had taken place. Their voices, long trained in worship, now opened not in duty, but in delight. What began as a ripple became a tidal wave, a chorus that swelled across the heavens. He is risen. 3 simple words, but they carried the weight of eternity. He is risen. It meant death had been crushed underfoot. It meant shame had lost its grip. It meant every tear that had ever fallen in longing, in sorrow, in prayer, now had an answer. It meant that the Lamb who had been slain was now standing, eyes ablaze with the fire of victory, heart still pulsing with the same compassion that had led him to the cross. And heaven could not hold back. Harps that had rested for centuries were lifted again. Voices that had sung over creation now harmonized in new melodies, ones that had never been sung before, because this song could only be born in resurrection. It was not just a celebration of what had happened, it was a celebration of what had become possible. Now, the gates of heaven would one day open for those who believed. Now the lost could be found. Now the broken could be healed. Now the sinner could be welcomed home, not as a servant, but as a child. And for the first time in all of eternity, heaven sang a song that belonged not only to angels, but to humanity. Because this victory was ours too. This celebration wasn't just in the skies. It echoed into hearts. It moved through the silence of early morning gardens and into homes filled with despair. It reached fishermen on shores and tax collectors at tables. It would reach lepers, widows, Roman centurions, slaves, philosophers, and kings. And though they did not hear the song in full, their souls did. Because when heaven celebrates, it is not confined to heaven. It spills into our memories, into our deepest longings, into the places inside us that are still waiting for resurrection. It spills into the voice of the one who says, I forgive you, into the tear of the one who says, I believe, into the trembling hands of someone who dares to hope again. The celebration began that morning, and it never ended. Heaven has been singing ever since, not a song of repetition, but a living, breathing anthem that grows louder every time one heart turns toward the light. Every time someone who thought they were too far gone realizes the tomb is empty, and always has been. It is a celebration that includes us when we lift our eyes, when we whisper his name, when we choose love over fear, truth over lies, grace over bitterness. We join the song, and though we cannot hear the fullness of that heavenly celebration yet, we carry its echo, a deep inner joy, a peace that passes understanding, a hope that death cannot kill, because the celebration of heaven is not built on circumstance. It is built on resurrection, on a Savior who died and then stood up, alive, and now everything is different. Everything is possible, and heaven rejoices still. Now that the stone is rolled away, the tomb is empty, and the King has risen. What remains? What is left for us, those who still walk the dusty paths of this world, who still wake to ordinary mornings and lie down in restless nights? What does the resurrection mean, not in theory, but in the quiet places of our daily lives, where fear whispers and doubt lingers? What remains is rest. Not the kind of rest the world offers, temporary, fragile, dependent on perfect circumstances, but a rest rooted in something unshakable. A rest anchored in the reality that Jesus Christ is alive, and because he lives, you are no longer a prisoner of what once held you down. This is not the kind of rest that requires you to escape life or hide from your problems. It is the kind of rest that walks beside you through the fire, through the grief, through the questions, and still says, you are safe. When Jesus rose, he didn't just walk out of a tomb. He walked into every weary soul who would one day look to him and ask, can I truly be free? And his answer is not a promise of ease, but a promise of presence. You don't have to carry it all anymore. Not your shame, not your failure, not your past, not even your need to have it all figured out. He carried it already to the cross. He buried it already in the tomb. And when he rose, he left it all behind. So why should you keep carrying what he already conquered? The rest he offers is not passive. It's not simply the absence of burden. It's the presence of peace, a kind of rest that lives inside you, like a stillness at the center of a storm. It doesn't deny the chaos. It simply refuses to be ruled by it. And this rest is not something you earn. You don't earn rest. You receive it. You step into it. You let go and you trust. Trust that he's already done the work. Trust that your value is not found in how perfectly you perform, but in the fact that the resurrected one calls you his own. This is the rest of a soul that knows it has been loved to the very depths. Loved even in rebellion. Loved through the darkest night. Loved when it did not deserve it, and still loved now. Loved to the point of death and then beyond it. It's the kind of rest that says you are not trying to earn God's approval, you already have it. You are not trying to win God's attention, you've always had it. You are not trying to crawl your way toward grace, you're already standing on it. When Jesus said, "It is finished," he wasn't just talking about his suffering, he was talking about your striving. And when he rose, he wasn't just giving you hope for heaven someday, he was giving you resurrection life today. A life where joy isn't dictated by your circumstances. A life where peace isn't shattered by every storm. A life where you don't have to pretend to be stronger than you are because his strength is enough. The rest you are invited into is not just about pausing, it's about belonging. You belong to a kingdom that cannot be shaken. You belong to a savior who knows your name. You belong to a story that is still unfolding, and your chapter is being written with grace. So breathe. You are not alone. You are not forgotten. You are not beyond redemption. And you are not too late. The same power that raised Christ from the dead now lives in you, not as a distant force, but as a gentle companion, walking with you, whispering truth to your soul. You are mine. You are loved. You can rest now. Rest in the resurrection. Rest in knowing that the tomb is still empty. Rest in knowing that your future is not built on your strength, but on his victory.
And as you lay your head down tonight, or walk through another day with trembling steps, remember this.
You are resting not in a religion, not in a rule book, not in a distant idea, but in a living Savior whose arms are always open, whose heart is always kind, and whose resurrection means that your story is not over. It has only just begun.